Willow Creek was the kind of town where nothing ever happened. A place of white picket fences, friendly neighbors, and quiet evenings. But one summer, something changed. It began with a single disappearance. Jessica Harper, 24 years old, vanished on her way home from work. Her car was found abandoned, her phone shut off, and no sign of a struggle. It was as if she'd been swallowed by the night. At first, the town chalked it up to a random tragedy. Maybe she'd run away. Maybe there was an accident. But then, it happened again, and again. Over the next 6 months, 5 more people disappeared without a trace. A college student walking back from a late-night class. A retired school teacher leaving the grocery store. A single mother heading home to her kids. Each disappearance was more baffling than the last. No connections, no witnesses, only fear. By then, Willow Creek wasn't the same quiet town anymore. People locked their doors in broad daylight. Parents refused to let their kids play outside. Rumors spread like wildfire. Was it a kidnapper? A cult? Something? Supernatural? Every theory seemed more outlandish than the last. But nothing could have prepared anyone for the truth. Months after the first disappearance, investigators stumbled upon a house that would change everything. Inside, they made a discovery so horrifying it defied comprehension. Artifacts, twisted, grotesque creations made from human remains. Who, or what, was responsible for these unspeakable crimes? And how had they gone unnoticed for so long? This is the story of a town's darkest secret and the relentless hunt for a monster. The disappearances in Willow Creek were no longer isolated tragedies. They had become the town's defining nightmare. 6 people had vanished without a trace, each disappearance stranger and more unnerving than the last. And while fear gripped the town, the police worked tirelessly, piecing together a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. It began with the trails near Harper Park, where 3 of the victims were last seen. Jessica Harper's abandoned car was found parked at the entrance, but beyond that, the woods offered no answers. The park, once a favorite spot for families and joggers, had become a place of dread. It was there, deep within its shadows, that investigators made their first discovery. Hidden among the overgrowth was a small, dilapidated cabin, its exterior barely visible beneath a tangle of vines. The inside told a grim story. Bolted restraints were mounted on the walls, and piles of discarded clothing and human hair lay scattered across the floor. Investigators knew they had found a key piece of the puzzle, but even this discovery raised more questions than answers. Who had used this place? And where were the victims now? For weeks, forensic teams combed the woods, searching for further evidence. Cadaver dogs were brought in, and divers scoured nearby ponds. But as days turned into weeks, the investigation stalled, and the people of Willow Creek began to lose hope. Then everything changed. Eric Stanton, a local handyman, disappeared from his home in the middle of the night. This time, the scene was different. His shattered kitchen window and the blood spatter on the walls pointed to a violent struggle. It was clear the perpetrator was growing bolder and far more dangerous. The escalation left detectives scrambling for answers. Searching for connections between the victims, they found an unlikely thread. All of them had attended a local art exhibit just weeks before their disappearances. The exhibit, called Visions of Mortality, was hosted by an enigmatic artist known only as AK. The centerpiece of the exhibit was a haunting painting titled The Skin We Live In, a grotesque image of a figure stitched together from fragments of human flesh. The exhibit provided the first tangible lead. Investigators interviewed attendees, looking for anyone suspicious. One woman described a quiet man who seemed particularly fixated on the most disturbing pieces. He wasn't just admiring the art, he was studying it. Meanwhile, detectives revisited the evidence from the cabin. A single hair, previously overlooked, provided the breakthrough they desperately needed. The DNA match led them to a local man, Adrian Kessler. The name was unremarkable, belonging to someone who had lived in Willow Creek for years. A carpenter by trade, Kessler was described by neighbors as polite but distant. He rarely socialized, spending most of his time working in his garage. The connection seemed tenuous at first, but as detectives dug deeper, Kessler's ties to the victims became undeniable. Not only had he attended the Visions of Mortality exhibit, but he had also completed small repair jobs at the homes of 2 victims. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. Surveillance on Kessler's property was initiated immediately. Investigators noticed strange patterns: late-night activity in his garage, deliveries of obscure tools and materials, and a general air of secrecy. It wasn't long before they had enough evidence to secure a search warrant. On the night of the raid, officers approached the modest home cautiously. Kessler was taken into custody without resistance, his demeanor unsettlingly calm. But it was what lay inside his garage that stunned even the most seasoned investigators. Behind a false wall, concealed from plain sight, they found what could only be described as a gallery of horror. The room was meticulously organized, each piece carefully displayed. Masks crafted from human skin hung on the walls, their features grotesquely distorted. Furniture, upholstered with flesh, stood as grotesque monuments to Kessler's depravity. Each artifact was a masterpiece of horror, created with meticulous attention to detail. As the evidence was catalogued and Kessler led away, one question loomed larger than the rest. How had this man, living quietly among them, managed to carry out such unspeakable acts for so long? The investigation was far from over. While Adrian Kessler's arrest answered the question of who, the far more disturbing question of why remained. To uncover the truth, detectives would need to dive deep into his past. A past that would reveal the psychological roots of his obsession and the horrifying motives behind his crimes. After Adrian Kessler's arrest, investigators braced themselves for what they might find in his home. The modest house on the outskirts of Willow Creek gave no outward indication of the horrors within, but as officers moved deeper into the property, they uncovered a scene that would haunt even the most seasoned detectives. The first red flag was Kessler's garage. The space was obsessively organized, with tools arranged on spotless pegboards and workbenches lined with neatly labeled containers. At first glance, it seemed like the workspace of a meticulous carpenter. But one thing stood out: the overwhelming scent of chemicals. A forensic team was called in to investigate, and what they uncovered would later be described as a chamber of horrors. Behind a false wall, concealed with painstaking precision, was a hidden room. Investigators pried open the entrance and stepped into what can only be described as a macabre gallery. The air was heavy and stale, the dim lighting casting grotesque shadows on the objects displayed inside. It was a space not meant to be found, let alone understood. The room was filled with art pieces, though calling them art felt like an insult to the term. Masks made from human skin were hung on the walls, their hollow eyes staring blankly back. A chair sat in the center of the room, its seat and backrest upholstered with flesh, stitched together with gruesome precision. On a pedestal, investigators found a lamp constructed from bones and skin, its grotesque shade dyed in faded hues of blood and decay. Each piece bore the horrifying signature of someone who not only knew anatomy, but had an obsessive need for control. Kessler's craftsmanship was chillingly meticulous. His grotesque creations revealed a level of precision that belied the monstrous acts required to make them. Every stitch, every cut, every detail suggested a man who was as much an artist as he was a killer. The discoveries didn't end there. In a locked freezer tucked in the corner of the room, investigators found the remains of multiple victims. Body parts were carefully preserved, cataloged, and labeled. It was clear that Kessler wasn't just creating art, he was collecting. Each victim was treated like a piece of raw material, reduced to their parts and reassembled according to his twisted vision. Forensic teams spent hours documenting the scene, cataloging every grotesque artifact. Evidence bags filled with tools, clothing fragments, and personal belongings told a silent story of the lives Kessler had taken. Among these items was a set of journals, worn notebooks filled with sketches and detailed notes that revealed the depths of his depravity. The sketches were particularly disturbing. Vivid depictions of dismemberment, flesh stitched together into masks, and furniture crafted from human remains. Each page offered a window into Kessler's disturbed mind. As the cataloging continued, detectives found clues that linked Kessler to his victims. Personal belongings, watches, rings, wallets, were tucked into drawers like trophies. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a missing persons flyer for Jessica Harper, pinned to the wall beside a grotesque painting. It wasn't just a crime scene, it was a shrine to his obsession. The discoveries were so overwhelming that many officers had to leave the scene to regain their composure. Others described feeling a profound sense of helplessness, as if they were standing in the presence of pure evil. One detective would later remark, "It wasn't just the sight of the room, it was the knowledge that someone could live among us, quietly, and do this." The raid on Kessler's home sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. News of the gruesome findings spread quickly, and for many, the horror of the crimes became almost too much to comprehend. How had Kessler managed to operate unnoticed for so long? And what kind of person could carry out such unspeakable acts? Forensic analysis would later confirm that the remains found in Kessler's garage belonged to all 7 missing victims. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of his methodology, but offered no relief from the horror of what he had done. Kessler wasn't just a murderer. He was a predator who viewed his victims as materials to be shaped and molded, their humanity erased in the name of his twisted vision. But even with Kessler in custody and the physical evidence cataloged, the investigation wasn't over. There was one lingering question investigators couldn't yet answer. Why? What had driven Adrian Kessler to commit such horrifying acts? To find the answer, detectives turned to his journals, which would reveal a chilling glimpse into his disturbed mind. The arrest of Adrian Kessler marked a turning point in the investigation, but it was far from the end of the story. As he was led from his home in handcuffs, his face betrayed no emotion, no fear, no regret. It was the expression of a man who had already accepted his fate, as though the life he had lived in secret was never meant to last forever. In the days following the arrest, investigators began piecing together how Kessler had remained hidden for so long. Neighbors described him as a quiet but polite man, someone who always waved hello but rarely engaged in conversation. His small woodworking business, run out of his garage, gave him a convenient excuse for the hours he spent there, working on what they assumed were furniture projects. It was this careful balance, blending in just enough while keeping everyone at arm's length, that allowed him to operate undetected for years. But the evidence found inside his home told a far different story. Investigators had uncovered not only physical evidence of his crimes, but also a disturbing psychological roadmap that explained how he had reached this point. Among the most chilling discoveries were Kessler's journals. Each page was meticulously written, detailing his thoughts, his methods, and, most disturbingly, his justification for the atrocities he committed. The journals revealed that Kessler viewed his victims not as people, but as materials. He wrote about transforming impermanence into permanence, describing his gruesome art as a way of preserving beauty in a world he saw as fleeting and fragile. Each victim was selected carefully, chosen not out of hatred but, as he described it, for their potential. To Kessler, he wasn't a murderer, he was an artist. One journal entry, dated just weeks before his arrest, read, "The skin is the canvas, the flesh is the medium. Life decays, but art endures. They are not gone, they are part of something eternal." forensic psychologists brought in to analyze his writings were unanimous in their conclusion. Adrian Kessler was a narcissistic sociopath, someone who lacked empathy and saw his actions as a twisted form of creative expression. The turning point in the investigation, the moment Kessler transitioned from suspect to perpetrator, came when detectives found a clear link between him and his victims. His journals contained sketches of each person he had taken, their likenesses hauntingly accurate. Alongside these drawings were notes about how he had followed them, observed their routines, and ultimately lured them into his trap. He had been meticulous, leaving almost no trace of his actions, until his obsession grew too large to contain. The escalation of his crimes was another critical revelation. In the beginning, Kessler had been cautious, targeting victims he believed no one would miss. But as his confidence grew, so did his brazenness. By the time of Eric Stanton's disappearance, he had stopped taking precautions entirely, leaving behind evidence that ultimately led to his capture. The timeline of his crimes was chilling. Investigators determined that Kessler's first victim, Jessica Harper, had been killed nearly 2 years before his arrest. Over time, he had refined his methods, perfecting the techniques he used to create his grotesque art pieces. What began as crude attempts at preserving human remains evolved into detailed and intricate works that horrified even the most hardened forensic specialists. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Kessler remained eerily silent during his interrogation. He refused to answer questions about his motives, his methods, or even his victims. It was as if speaking about his actions would somehow diminish the significance he attached to them. His only words during the initial questioning were a chilling statement: "They're not gone. They live through me." The arrest brought a sense of relief to Willow Creek, but it also left a permanent scar on the town. For months, residents had lived in fear, wondering who could be responsible for the horrors unfolding around them. To learn that the culprit had been a seemingly ordinary man living among them only deepened their sense of betrayal. How could someone like Kessler, quiet, polite, and unassuming, harbor such dark and monstrous secrets? For the victims' families, the revelation was a bittersweet moment. They finally had answers, but those answers came with the weight of unimaginable grief. Knowing their loved ones had been reduced to materials in Kessler's grotesque vision of art was a pain that no justice could ever erase. As Adrian Kessler awaited trial, the full scope of his crimes became a subject of national attention. Experts debated whether he was a psychopath driven by an uncontrollable compulsion or a cold, calculating predator who took pleasure in his work. But one thing was certain: his crimes would forever serve as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind the most unassuming facades. Adrian Kessler's arrest brought an end to a reign of terror, but the scars he left on Willow Creek would never fade. Families of the victims struggled to reconcile the horrific truth that their loved ones had been reduced to materials in Kessler's grotesque vision. The community, once peaceful and trusting, now bore the weight of suspicion and fear. Kessler's trial was swift and conclusive, with overwhelming evidence ensuring his conviction. He showed no remorse, his chilling demeanor remaining unchanged as the verdict was read. Experts called him a monster of opportunity, but for those closest to the case, he was a reminder of humanity's darkest potential. In the years since, Willow Creek has sought healing. Memorials were erected for the victims, their names etched in stone to honor their memory. Yet the story of Adrian Kessler remains a cautionary tale, a reminder that true evil often hides in plain sight.